Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this CanEurope webinar on the Irish Presidency of the Council of the European Union. This webinar is co-hosted with the European Environmental Bureau, with the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, with the EUKI Academy, and with the Irish Environmental Network. We are so glad to see many of you here. We have already 100 people in the room. It's excellent to see this level of interest, and I hope we will have an interesting discussion over the next 90 minutes. So my name is Joe Inwood. I am working at CanEurope in the network development team, and I will give you very short housekeeping remarks before we get into the substance of our agenda this afternoon. So we will be starting off with introductory words from the director of CanEurope, Chiara Martinelli. And then we are very glad to be joined by Philip Nugent, who is the Assistant Secretary for EU, International and Marine Affairs at the Irish Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment. So Philip will be speaking about the priorities ahead for the Irish presidency over the next 6 months. We're then very glad to have the input of Clitos Papastiliano, who is Head of Environmental Policy at Terra Cypria, who will speak about some of the lessons that have been learned from the outgoing presidency of Cyprus, in particular for civil society seeking to engage with the presidency. Then that will be followed by an assessment of the Irish presidency priorities that have been published recently. If you haven't had a chance to look at them, we'll hear an assessment of those from Sven Harmeling, who is Head of Climate at CanEurope, and Gerry McEverley, who is Head of Policy at Friends of the Earth Ireland. Following this, we will have 2 more interventions from Arianna Labassin, who will speak about the European Environmental Bureau's 10 points from the EEB's memorandum for the Irish presidency, and Dr. Ciara Brennan, who is Director of Environmental Justice Network Ireland, who will speak about the role that the Irish presidency can play in steering negotiations on the next multi-annual financial framework towards climate action and a just transition. So that's the next long-term EU budget in plain language. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to the Director of CanEurope, Chiara Martinelli, who will give us some welcoming words.
Voila. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So nice to be here and opening this webinar. And as Joe said, thanks again for making the time. I will be very brief because we are so lucky to have, the possibility to listen to many of you and many, hopefully also some time for question and answers. And a special thank to you, Philip, for making the time. Welcome, really, Philip, especially to, I would call it a climate movement stock take on where we are before this kickoff of the Irish presidency of the European Union. So it's a tradition for our network, not only for CanEurope, for many around the table, to really have this moment as civil society to see how we can exchange and also boost our efforts in shaping, influencing, and supporting climate and energy and environmental policies on the 6 months ahead and under the presidency of one or the other member states. So very happy to have this exchange with all of you. And why it's important for us is because we are definitely in this composition wanted to show that we believe in dialogue with civil society, and we believe on the crucial role that civil society can play at the EU level with this lift working between national actions and national support and members of all our networks and the work we do here in Brussels, and working with the presidency has been in the last year a very good expression of this model, of this tier of change in working. And we are not only doing it because we think that then we will kick our box on impact in our grants or in the work that we are doing, is because for us is fundamental the role that we see ourselves playing on what we call the social acceptance of energy and climate and environmental policies at the EU level moving forward. And this is why we are here also in this context that is not the easiest for our movement at the moment and for climate action and environmental action in general. And that's why maybe I would like to stress also that we really welcome the Irish presidency public rejection of the deregulation agenda when it comes to climate and environmental policies. And that's, I mean, this is really promising for us, like on embarking in these next 6 months, working together, and also see what we can add or not add to the work moving forward. Also, I wanted to flag that we want to do this work from, as for every presidency, really by following the leadership of national civil society, in this case, by the Irish civil society that we know, Philip, you know quite well. So we will hear more also during the webinar. Because again, like this, we feel is also our role as a network, also pan-European network, to making sure that the driver really sit in member states. I mean, we are witnessing every day more and more, like our also, how can I say, like the limitations of everything that is really coming only from this EU bubble. Doesn't have a very long story, right? So, and a very lasting experience. So how is important that these two levels like are moving together. I just wanted maybe a couple of words on what we are living in terms of European policies. European climate and environmental policy at this moment is still I would say a climate of attempt to dismantle some of the acquis, but also an attempt to reduce and shrink the civil society role within those processes. So we are very much aware that this is the context we are in, and we are trying to get more proactive and keep ourselves to counter this trend moving forward. The next 6 months, I don't have to tell to anyone here in the call, are crucial for shaping the next steps of European climate action and environmental action moving forward. A couple of examples that we see really important on the next 6 months and the presidency agenda, starting from maintaining and improving ambition in the review of the ETS, as we see it as an emblematic and also key pillar of EU climate policies that will really give all our efforts now are really looking into the 15 July review proposal, but also because we believe this will also set the tone for everything that will come next in terms of climate ambition moving forward. So as a setting the tone for the development of the EU post-2030 climate and energy framework, that will be very crucial file for the next 6 months, then the negotiation of the multi-annual financial framework. And I think that is where you will hear many priorities, because it's always very difficult to limit those priorities. But I mentioned those that I will say we will monitor also more closely on the way forward. I also wanted to maybe a point on narrative. I mean, our hope looking at the Irish presidency is also that we can move from a crisis management agenda to a more kind of structural, future-proof climate and energy architecture, so that we can really answer also to the needs and the expectations of people on the ground. I mentioned people at national level, but I would say this counts also for our international agenda. And this is my last point. We're very much looking forward to work with the Irish presidency that has quite a track record on climate diplomacy and climate negotiations, but also in terms of the commitment that Ireland already took in moving out of this crisis mode with, for example, the next transitioning away from fossil fuels conference for 2020-27. So with that, I think I stop because my time is very limited, and I just wish everyone a very fruitful exchange. Thanks so much for everyone involved in the preparation of this webinar, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Chiara, for these words of setting the scene and also introducing some of the topics and the themes we will be discussing this afternoon. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. Philip Nugent. In the meantime, if you have questions or thoughts that you would like to share in the chat, please feel free to drop those there, but we will have time for some open Q&A and discussion in the final 30 minutes. So Philip, you have the floor.
Thanks, Joe. Just to confirm, everybody can hear me okay? Got a thumbs up from Oisin. That's great. Thank you, Chiara. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Oisin, and also to Karen for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here and appreciate the time that you're all giving to this, to listen to me talk about Ireland's presidency priorities. It's a big week this week. It all kicks off on the 1st of July, but to be truthful about it, it kicked off about 18 months, 2 years ago, as we started to prepare and structure our department in a way that would enable it to do a presidency well. And I suppose it's important to kind of to start with what's the role of the presidency. So I'm not here today to talk about national positions on climate files or energy files. Our job over the next 6 months, and really this has been true for probably the last 3 months as well, has been to think about stewarding key files through council and not having national positions get in the way of that. So taking a step back from articulating national positions and stepping forward into driving forward the business of council more generally, which is a tricky thing to do. And I'll maybe say a word or two about that in a moment. Lots of people, and Chiara has alluded to it as well, talk about Ireland as having a kind of a good track record in terms of both climate diplomacy, but also having done presidencies well in the past. So we are, I think, generally regarded as a member state who can step up whenever the presidency role comes around. There are a few structural things that I think enable us to do that. This will be, I think, presidency number 8 for Ireland, and it'll be my 3rd. My first was in 2004 when I was based in the Perm Rep in Brussels as a much younger AO, and it was a formative experience for me. It was just such a brilliant privilege, great opportunity. We worked hard. I got to enjoy living somewhere else for a while, but just being at the heart of driving the business of the EU for that 6-month period was really rewarding. You get the kind of the demob blues at the end whenever your phone stops ringing, literally the next day, but that's fine. It's not personal. It's just the way things go. But in terms of why Ireland, I think, has certain advantages. I think that, okay, so this is presidency number 8. That's a depth of experience to be able to draw on, and lots of people in the system have been through the process before. I think we're in that sort of sweet spot in terms of size of administration. So I think for some countries, the burden of running a presidency is so great that it inevitably kind of distorts the domestic EU kind of balance for them. It's just such a big thing to take on. I think Cyprus has done a fantastic job. And if you think about the way the world turned out for Cyprus very shortly after the start of their presidency, or in the Middle East, a foot and mouth outbreak to contend with at home. So a really good example of how all the preparation in the world can't prepare you for every eventuality, and things will happen that will threaten to derail. But I think Cyprus has done a fantastic job. But for a small member state, for the smaller member states like Luxembourg, Cyprus, Malta, it's just such a massive undertaking that it can sometimes, I think, get in the way of the domestic agenda as well. And if you look at the other extreme, if you look at, say, the Germanys, France, Spain, Italy, because they're so large and so well resourced, they have strong positions on pretty much every issue. And that can sometimes be a disadvantage because they don't have the dynamism to be able to respond in the way that, say, Cyprus has to war in the Middle East, foot and mouth disease. So the fact that the decision-making chain in the Irish administration is very, very short, sometimes disconcertingly short, it does bring an advantage that if we need to get a decision fast in order to change direction on something, it can happen very quickly. So that agility, I think, is really important. Plus, as I say, we don't tend to get in our own way in the way that some large member states do. So, for example, some of the larger member states can struggle with the neutrality of the presidency role and national positions will kind of get in the way. So that's another advantage that I think that we have. So there's a huge amount of expectation, I think, on the Irish presidency. Part of that is down to, the track record that we have. I think also it's down to the current circumstances in which the EU finds itself. And Chiara mentioned some of those things. And the fact that the Green Deal atmosphere is no longer there. So the challenge for people working in the sustainability space is to maybe shift the argument and shift the narrative to say, okay, look, we need to think about these things in a different way and sort of not necessarily come at them purely from a sustainability lens, but to link them to security and competitiveness, which I think is a very, very winnable argument. And I think it's essential to link all of these things to both security and competitiveness. Our national priorities at this point are set, and they're well published from about 3 weeks ago, I think, at this stage. So competitiveness, security, and values. And just to say a little bit about each of those, as I just mentioned, I think everything now is being viewed through the lens of competitiveness. That goes back to Draghi and before. So a general desire, I think, across all institutions to ensure that new legislation, new policy is meeting a competitiveness goal first. So I think everything in the Irish presidency agenda across all the council formations will have that as a sort of a touchstone at the outset. The security piece, I think, refers to the fact, obviously, that the security position, particularly on the eastern border, has changed significantly over the last decade. But it's intended to not just refer to military security, it also covers things like food security and energy security. And all of these things are increasingly linked. So security is not just in that defense and security lens that it might previously have been viewed. And then the values bit in the overarching Irish presidency priorities refers to that commitment to multilateralism that has benefited Ireland hugely, both as a member state and then as a member of the UN and multiple other fora, which we have contributed to very actively. And again, that links in my own area to the very significant multilateral engagement that we will have in the back end of the year, being involved in the desertification COP, co-owning, if you like, the presidency function on the CBD COP, COP17, with our colleagues in the Ministry for Housing. Then the big one, the climate COP in Antalya. And then also we have a really fantastic experience, opportunity this year to do a lot of the preparatory work for the first COP on the Convention on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. The COP itself will probably take place at the start of the Lithuanian presidency, but we'll get to do a lot of the running. And Chiara mentioned that idea of framing the discussion. That's really key for us on some of our specific files, and I'll come back to some of those in a moment. But the values piece is primarily intended to refer to our commitment to multilateralism, which we will see through. And obviously, in the current environment where multilateralism is under threat, we will want to highlight the fact that the issues that we're faced with are so large and global, regional, that multilateralism is the only way in which to proceed with those, including also a role for plurilateral type initiatives, and TAP is a good example of that. To think then specifically about the key files or the key objectives within the environment and energy climate space, if you were to ask me what would I be looking for as indicators of a successful presidency for the Ministry for Climate, Energy and Environment, I would say finalisation of the grids package, political agreement on ETS, and to have left behind a new way for the EU to prepare for COP. So the first two are covered by One Europe, One Market. The third is something that our Minister wrote to Commissioner Hoekstra on in January, having come away from COP30 in Brazil last year, with a sense of frustration, not necessarily at the outcome itself, because as a small country, whether we're presidency or not, it's very hard to exert significant influence on the outcome. But what we can do, I think, is ensure that the EU prepares in a better way. So last year was very disjointed and quite messy, kind of overlap between NDCs and the beginning of COP and the finalization of the European Climate Law, the 2040 target, and with leaders departing for Brazil without NDCs having been submitted. And that was a bad look for the EU, and it meant that we were on the back foot from the very start. And we were put in a position in Brazil last year where we were presented to we were made to look to some of our traditional partners as being out of touch, elitist, and only interested in our own priorities around mitigation. And it meant that in the final days, we were very isolated. And by we, I mean the EU. And we need to properly address that. And one of the key factors, I think, last year, and again, the Minister referred to this in his letter to the Commissioner, was that collectively the EU had failed to internalize what the absence of the US meant for COP. And not only the absence of the US, but the kind of the active undermining of the process from outside by the US. So how do we do that differently? How do we ensure that we turn up not necessarily with positions agreed with the Arab group or with China or with India, but a clearer understanding of what their priorities are, how we might be able to find common ground in some of those areas, and also how we can ensure that we're in a position where we're communicating in a more empathetic way with our traditional partners. So mitigation is a key issue for the EU. Adaptation is far more significant for many of our partners, the SIDS in particular. So how do we communicate both to say mitigation is our priority? We understand that adaptation is a much more significant priority for you. How can we bridge that and make sure that we're pushing forward the objectives of both perspectives? Because again, as I say, last year we were put in a position where we appeared to be kind of out of touch and pushing a mitigation message which wasn't the priority for others. So as I say, those are the COP process is a really significant one for us. And again, in a process where 120,000 people all descend on a location to all add value and work towards an outcome, we can't guarantee what the outcome will be, but I think what we would like to leave behind would be a much better way of doing things. And that means, for example, to give you a few specifics, to ensure that the EU turns up to COP with a negotiating mandate that isn't articulated over 25 pages of council conclusions that just serves to show the level of disunity in the EU. So much sharper, shorter focus on the 3-4 key strategic things that the EU wants, and then also to have a very clear idea of what are the areas where the EU can give. And we think that climate finance is an area where the EU can give, not necessarily growing the number, but making really practical changes to access to climate finance, because we hear this again and again that access to climate finance is almost as much of an issue as the overall pot of funding would be available. So we've got some ideas on how we can take a leadership role and lead by example in that, and I think Ireland is already doing so in the way that we do make climate finance available. But there are, we think, from discussions with the UNFCCC, ways in which access to finance can be made much less burdensome. And yeah, we'll work on those. To jump back just temporarily to the narrative around COP, and I think it's linked to the way in which we communicate, continuing with the objectives of the Green Deal, but in a way that kind of addresses the competitiveness and security concerns. We need to articulate the message differently at COP. And it needs to be, if we are pursuing, say, electrification or mitigation as an EU priority, then we need to be promoting that globally as a thing that will deliver jobs, will improve people's lives, will give access to clean cooking for women and girls in Africa, etc., rather than communicating the message of mitigation as an emissions reduction thing, because that will ring hollow for people in countries where access to very, very basic living standards is a much greater challenge. So how does the drive towards electrification and mitigation and the energy transition actually improve people's lives today, tomorrow, rather than a thing that will help to tackle climate change in future years? To mention some of the other legislative priorities, we're a little bit disappointed that we're receiving key files later in our presidency than we would have hoped. We would have loved to be dealing with the Circular Economy Act earlier, but we'll probably be unable to do anything more than have a policy debate in the December Council. I personally and our department would very much love to have had the Oceans Act much earlier. And I know there's some people on the call who will have heard me talk about this recently as well. It is disappointing that we're not going to get that until possibly December, the second week in December. So we won't even be able to have a policy debate on that. So that's a disappointment. But what we will do, and we're having an event in Wexford next week, which is kind of anticipating the content of the Oceans Act and talking about the things that we think would be usefully addressed in that. And I would encourage anybody who's interested, who may not have registered yet, to register for that event. We've got some great speakers. Chiara also mentioned the need to get away from kind of crisis management, and we will be encouraging ministers to have a kind of a strategic discussion around EU energy policy at possibly the informal in September. So how do we ensure that the most recent energy crisis is Europe's last? How do we take a kind of a Draghi type approach to kind of longer term energy policy planning? And this is key, obviously, to the post 2030 package. But also it's about ensuring that we are less exposed to the external shocks, or no longer exposed to the external shocks that we have seen, just how fragile and exposed we are. Finally, then, to mention the post 2030 climate package. This is also appearing slightly later than we had anticipated. So again, that narrative piece is important for us. We will have a kickoff discussion at the December Council. The narrative bit is really important here, and it's about ensuring that discussion is approached through the lens of competitiveness as well as emissions reduction, climate action. So how do we ensure that ambition is seen as an investment in the EU's long-term competitiveness, as well as ensuring that the EU is at the cutting edge of emissions reductions and tackling climate change? We think that the two things can be done at the same time, but it's important, if we're going to bring the different camps along with us, that we can make that argument strongly and cogently, because there are others that we've seen from the way things are shaping up on ETS, that anything that has a climate focus is being presented as sort of environmental fundamentalism that is at odds with the drive for competitiveness. That's a false argument in our view, and we need to ensure that we can tackle that argument and refute it. I think I'll leave it there in terms of priorities. I think I've probably thrown a lot out there. A mix of disappointment at some of the files that are going to be appearing late, but I think we can get those conversations off to a really positive start. I think we're clear on the absolute top priorities for us. There's a strong personal commitment that the minister has, in particular, around ensuring that COP process is improved, and that we leave that behind as a legacy, because I know the Australian COP presidency of negotiations have in mind that this could be quite a significant landmark COP. There's probably a broader consensus that thinks that this is more likely to be an implementation COP. But if this is an implementation COP, and COP in 2 years' time is more of a fight in terms of the second global stocktake, then we need a really robust process that enables the EU to identify core priorities and treat climate diplomacy as a 365 days of the year thing, rather than a 2-week thing in November every year, with everything on the line for that. Last thing, just to say, the transition away from fossil fuels, really delighted to be doing that. It will be, I think it makes sense for us to sort of continue in this mode of hosting significant events post-presidency. I'm very happy to be doing it with Tuvalu. I discovered in Colombia, when talking to the minister from Tuvalu, that they have a large number of O'Briens apparently living in Tuvalu. So it'll be like the minister coming home whenever he goes there next year. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you so much, Philip, for giving us some indications of the kind of agility and dynamism that the Irish presidency hopes to bring to this role. So we will hear in just a moment some perspectives from the EU level civil society and Irish civil society on the presidency priorities as they've been published. But first, we will actually hear from Clitos Papastiliano, who is the head of policy at Terra Cypria, which is a member of both CanEurope and the European Environmental Bureau in Cyprus. So Clitos will speak about some of the lessons that have been learned from civil society in Cyprus during the current presidency, just as it comes to an end. So Clitos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joe. Sorry. So from my side, I'll try to keep it short. This was the second rotating presidency of the Council of the EU. The first one was back in the second semester of 2012. So we will say a more conservative rather than progressive agenda. Can we move to the next slide, please? Sorry, Joe, I cannot handle the. So regarding the policies that the presidency, the policy priorities of the presidency, CAP was the first one, MMF the second one. Joe, next, please. Energy and climate issues. I think we all know this, so I'm not getting into details. Next, please. So what I would like to stress from our side is that systemic challenges do matter. This is one of the lessons learned through our engagement to this presidency. So global geopolitics marked by increasing instability and reshaping of security dynamics. There was a reference to that before. Apart from the Russia invasion in Ukraine, we had an escalation of conflict and war in the Middle East with a strike in Cyprus as well during the presidency. I think that was probably the first time that the member state of the EU holding the presidency had to face this. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, meaning escalating of energy crisis and a discussion towards a fossil fuel expansion. Disruptive foreign interference and vested interests that are not aligned with overriding public interest and environmental scientific consensus, a shift from a more progressive to a more conservative agenda. If I had to share my personal view through my experience and engagement in the two presidencies from a civil society perspective, I would say a move from the pillars on environment, sustainability, resource efficiency, social cohesion, solidarity, etc., to more security, defense readiness, preparedness, competitiveness, economic security, and sufficient financing. I do share the view of Philip. There are ways to link this. I mean, climate, particularly climate and energy issues, are related to security, competitiveness, etc., but sometimes not in the same way that the issues are raised. A rise of populism and strengthening of the far right agenda. Next, please. That implies weakening of social, political, and environmental rights, corrosion of democracy and undermining of the rule of law, drift towards models of climate denial, deregulation, and misinformation. I'm stressing out the word deregulation here, and I'm happy to hear that the Irish presidency will try to do its best on this matter. Bringing us to dismantling of environmental safeguards without scientific evidence, impact assessments, or proper citizen consultation, and of course, insufficient funding, weak enforcement, and a lack of ambition on environmental policies. Next, please. So, from our side, weaknesses, constraints, and threats. I have to stress out that we are a small organization of a staff of 10 people, 3 of us working on policy issues, the executive director, Kula, me as head of environmental policy, and until recently, Maria was working on climate and energy issues. Unfortunately, during the presidency, one of the 3 of us, Maria, had to step out for for health reasons. So the problem of limited resources impact on strategic planning and the engagement of civil society, in combination with things that are not planned but do appear on the way. There was a limited capacity at some points for monitoring, advocacy work, and communication of an extremely broad policy agenda. And broader systemic challenges impact on environmental policy agenda, particularly the escalation of war in the Middle East and the conflict between the US and Iran. But in terms of prospects and opportunities, I would say national organizations can strengthen cooperation and communication with pan-European networks, in our case, EMB and CanEurope. An opportunity is also related to building strong alliances with civil society at the national level and forming strong coalitions in order to raise issue and influence the agenda, take advantage of political and administrative contacts at the national level, and of course try to balance different positions between member states while advancing strategic policy priorities. I deliberately tried to keep it as short as possible. We can discuss it further in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clitos. That's much appreciated, this intervention to show the continuity also in some of the challenges that may well be faced by colleagues in Ireland over the next 6 months. So all that said, we will now go to a joint presentation from Sven Harmeling, who is the head of Climate Action Network Europe, and Gerry McEverley from Friends of the Earth Ireland. After this, we will pause for some first questions from the floor. So I will give the floor first to Sven and then to Gerry.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you very much, Joe. And also thanks a lot in particular to the previous speakers, which I think were already very useful scene setting. So I will try to give a bit of a short overview of what are some of CanEurope's, let's say, priorities and linking it to what the Irish presidency has communicated. But I wanted to start off with this. I mean, probably all of this call, we don't really need a reminder, but I think it's always important to go back to the science. And here, basically, you see the temperature differences in Europe in June, or basically it was last week, sorry, not even in June, and last week, compared to long-term averages. And the wording, I mean, the verdict is out, so to say, that scientists have also shown us that fossil fuel emissions have rapidly worsened European heat waves in just a few decades. So if you know a bit of the work around attribution science, you see that there's more and more evidence that without the level of fossil fuel burning we've seen in recent decades, these extremes we are witnessing now at this point in time in the year and at this expansion would have been very unlikely and less unlikely that we see it here. So I think that's a constant reminder to feed into the current discussion that we need to move away from fossil fuels. Next slide, please. So, I mean, Philip already mentioned these three headline terms, if I may say so, of the Irish presidency priorities: competitiveness, values, security. I think it's very obvious that all of these are connected to a determined response to the climate and fossil energy crisis. And without this determined response, we will also lose out on these three priorities. Of course, there are a lot of more details and nuances to this, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that depending on how the EU and also the presidency, let's say, performs or appears to perform on those topics, there may also be trade-offs, right? I think we've seen often in the international context that let's say, a competitiveness approach by the EU, which is regarded as maybe too selfish, too egoistic, and too self-interest oriented, can also undermine values of multilateral collaboration and the belief in the EU also sticking to its own values. I'm not saying this is always the case, but I think we are aware, and it's similar, maybe true for security issues. So it's also important to, let's say, have a good idea of the interconnections between these priorities, but where we see in the context of climate and fossil energy crisis a lot of potential to treat all of those together. In terms of some of the main priorities, and of course this links to some of what Philip has already laid out from the president's perspective. The further work on the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework, is critical. I will not go into that in more detail because there's a separate presentation, but you can find more details also in the most recent letter that CanEurope sent to the European Council. ETS, very critical. The Commission proposal comes out on 15th July. We know many are very active. Unfortunately, many are also working towards weakening the ETS. Which is definitely not, which is what we need to defend against and push back against. And where I've just highlighted here very briefly some of the main priorities that it's, in our view, about keeping the existing cap trajectory at least until 2036. And also the planned phase out of free allocations, and these also need to be linked to strong decarbonization investment conditionalities. Without going too much into technical details, but this cap trajectory, some you can all call it also more technically the linear reduction factor, is very decisive for the overall emissions that the system allows, and where we I think unfortunately see a trend that this is what maybe member states and parliament at the moment care least about. If you see the discussions about how to weaken this reduction factor, so that's very critical to work against. Also, the use of ETS revenues can be improved as key parameters here. We also see an importance in that period to pursue a permanent tax on fossil fuel excess profits, which of course links closely also to the discussion on new own resources under the MFF, but that would send both a signal to move out of fossil fuel investments as well as generating larger resources to invest into the overall priorities that the EU needs to work towards. You mentioned the grids package. That's definitely a very important element as we need in a modern, interconnected and flexible electricity grid as a backbone of a secure, affordable and resilient European energy system. Next slide, please. On the post-2030 energy and climate framework, I think one of the challenges is, as you also laid out, that the legislative files seem to be only expected for late November, maybe early December. But as you said, the framing before that is also important to influence member states' approach and, of course, the Commission's approach before that. We see a number of key elements here, and we combined here for the purpose of the presentation both the climate and energy framework. They are not all in the same legislations, even if there are some overlaps. But we need, of course, a policy design which accounts for potential social impacts and diverse realities across the EU. We need to maintain a system of binding and ambitious targets, both on the energy side of things, renewables and energy efficiency targets, as well as on the national climate targets, where we see a strong need for a separation also between emission reduction targets, biogenic removals and permanent removals in a system of robust compliance, and where at the moment I feel the tendency to go for simpler rules and simpler approaches opens up a lot of new questions, which makes the whole thing even potentially more difficult. So that it requires a smart, let's say, approach for simplification, which keeps the targets and keeps the ambition. And I think in the last years we have seen too many proposals which basically undermine the ambition. We need to establish a framework to end EU's dependence on fossil fuels, and fossil gas exit as a particular important element here to drive forward. We need strengthened EU climate and energy governance and implementation, including in the governance regulation and other tools. We need to accelerate renewables-based electrification, as well as scaling up energy efficiency. We also have a lot of concerns about the planned integration of international credits into the EU climate policy framework, and have a lot of good arguments, I feel, why it shouldn't be done, or at least kept as limited as possible, given the political decisions. And we also see a need for an EU-level target for the agriculture sector. As you said, many of these things will just open up during the presidency, but the discussions ahead of the proposals are critical. Finally, coming to the international scene, the road towards COP31, we listen and see also the EU discussing that it needs to refine its strategy. I think it's very important to not only think about EU's own priorities, and you mentioned some of them, but embed early on in your work the listening to others and thinking really how can we support the priorities of others to build a stronger package. So I think that's important to think about how to deliver the just transition mechanism, what role the EU can play, increasing public finance, in particular for adaptation. There are the debates about the mitigation work program, and of course, generally accelerate the implementation of RE-based electrification and transition away from fossil fuels roadmaps. Some of this will not feature, let's say, inside the real negotiations, but in the surroundings of the negotiation space. But even there, it's critical to perform strongly. Happy to engage also further with the EU and the presidency. We've had some initial discussions already in Bonn at the session recently. You mentioned the Santa Marta to Tuvalu process. Very important to keep and maintain that momentum, even if it's not formally, let's say, the EU presidency mandate. But I think that's very, and we already see first steps taken by Ireland with Tuvalu. That's very, very good. We also had some recent engagement with international society on that already. So please keep up the spirit of inclusiveness, the spirit of ambition here. And then maybe just finally a few opportunities from our side, which we as CanEurope and civil society normally engage on, is on the decision making for the formal positions in ECOFIN and ENVI COP31 positions. We want to continue our high level engagements we normally have with the EU delegations, both ahead and at the COP, but also appreciate and underline the importance of the more technical level exchange, whether it's in the EU working groups, whether it's with the topical leads, and will probably reach out to the Irish presidency in different occasions and several times to play a role in that and keeping that civil society engagement as strong as possible and even advance it. So I leave it with that and hand back to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sven. So without further ado, we go on to Gerry.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, that's great. Hi, everyone. I'm Gerry McEverley. I'm Head of Policy in Friends of the Earth and also on the steering committees of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, which is Ireland's main climate justice NGO coalition, and on the steering committee of the environmental pillar, so Ireland's main campaigning network on the environmental side, which is both wonderful, but also means I can guarantee I will accidentally leave out an important area that's relevant to particular groups. This is not an exhaustive list of priorities, I should emphasize. I'm just going to go on a very quick whistle-stop tour of maybe what we consider some of the priorities and how it interlinks with national policy, hopefully in the next 9 minutes or so. So very briefly on just on the context, I mean, first of all, really many thanks to Philip for coming along and presenting. I could say that, you know, by European standards or EU standards, Ireland does play a very constructive role on many climate, environmental and energy issues and some very committed fields. Domestically, it would be an understatement to say that many organisations would feel that government is not championing the climate and environmental agenda to the extent it should, notwithstanding some major exceptions. But, you know, it's often talked about how the president does not mean unilaterally disagreeing or agreeing on particular provisions. It's evidently about being constructive or responsive chair. Those of you who are in Brussels are more than familiar with this, but I guess it's important for people to be clear. And I think many of us who are also members of CanEurope would also be very clear that the president does set the agenda. It sets the pace of negotiations. It decides how ambitious or weak compromise amendments are, which are pushed to council working groups. It can decide to be a constructive or less than constructive in terms of negotiating positions with the European Parliament. So again, this will be obvious to those who are based in Brussels, but it's important to be clear that it's the chair who determines, I guess, the extent of ambition. And that's why we're particularly interested in or sensitive to potentially how national positions do or do not inform how Irish presidency that's the agenda. To be specific, I'm going to cover 5 areas try to cover 5 areas very briefly. first of all, on climate policy and Ireland's role in leading the review of the climate framework for 2030, and also bearing in mind, further negotiations related to the 2040 climate target. It's a really obviously relevant time because of the horrendous heat waves that people are experiencing across Europe, and in Ireland. I guess we really feel solidarity, or want to express our solidarity with those who are really suffering. But in terms of how this maybe links with national policy, we'd be quite conscious of extensive discussions regarding use of flexibilities and review of the 2040 target, and that's because Ireland is not on track to meet its own EU 2030 climate target. Also on renewables, this will result in significant non-compliance costs, and it's also quite relevant to the national context, given that the Irish government has chosen to disapply aspects of climate law in particular bill. And I guess this puts its willingness to support more specificity in EU climate law into focus. It also raises significant concerns regarding, potential proposals to shift measurement of methane. A lot I've passed over there, but that's one area. Just finishing off the climate area, this is maybe a cross-cutting point, but I think the Irish government would be quite strong by European standards on, the real importance of renewables rollout for security purposes. You've heard about the grids package, but it's perhaps not 100% clear to us that politically all parts of government would understand that more renewables does not necessarily mean emissions reductions, and more renewables is not the same thing as fossil fuel phase out. And I emphasize that point because I think we are going to increasingly hear more about it's completely correct, the urgent need for significantly more renewables development and grid development than, the energy price crisis and the fossil fuel crisis, which we're experiencing. But, actually reaching where we all want to get, both in Ireland and at EU level, politically, government needs to be clear that fossil fuel phase out needs to happen at the same time. That's perhaps an obvious point to say, but it needs to be reflected in policy. I mentioned there before about energy security, which is a major priority. This is my next area, which is a major priority for the Irish government, or perhaps like security more generally. Government has noted the need to meaningfully progress the energy security framework. And this is quite important, not only from a grids perspective, but also how it treats gas phase out and reliance on gas, because Ireland is hugely reliant on gas for its electricity generation. And it has argued repeatedly, and certain parts, I would say almost disingenuously, that the European Security of Gas Supply Regulation requires it to develop an LNG terminal. Ireland is currently in the process of putting through a bill to develop a state-owned LNG terminal, which is hugely controversial with many of us.
Gerry, sorry to interrupt. Your connection, I think your audio is a little bit cutting, so sometimes it's quite hard to hear you. But I think when you're a little bit closer to the microphone, it's better. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll maybe also try to speak slower. So my simple point with the energy security framework is that how it treats gas security of supply, and reviewing that will be particularly important. On to another area which I'm not going to do sufficient justice on is on the whole area of simplification, or which many in Friends of the Earth would refer to as, increasing focus on deregulation. But there are perhaps two main areas within that I think many NGOs are quite focused on, which is environmental omnibus and proposal on the perspective on accelerating permit granting. This is, again, in terms of the grids package, it's really important, but we need to make sure that environmental standards are not watered down. There's also a a proposal on speeding up environmental assessments, and there's the concern that Ireland has perhaps suggested that key environmental directives like the Birds and Habitats Directive and the Water Framework Directive be amended. And then lastly, on the simplification side, it would be remiss of me not to touch briefly upon the AI omnibus and also how perhaps the EU AI action plan will be reconsidered or prioritized, just given how central data center policy has been, data center development rather, has been in Ireland, which has put huge pressure on our electricity system and resulted in significant fossil fuel lock-in. And also, given the fact that we're aware that some of the larger tech companies have lobbied aggressively against transparency provisions in EU law on their energy use. So that would be a further important area. Very briefly, of course, the ETS2 safeguards is a further area. I'm not going to get the chance to explain this fully, but I think CanEurope itself has argued, that affordability should be addressed through the use of social climate fund, rather than weakening carbon price signal. And it's also supported maintaining a strong ETS while protecting vulnerable households. So that's a further area, also given that important area, also given that the social climate plan, Ireland hasn't produced a social climate plan yet. To finish up on COP and Santa Marta, we really welcome, ministers, Minister O'Brien's leadership in this space and leading the EU at COP31. And I also appreciate that some of the sensitivities and limitations in the EU negotiating position that Philip mentioned rose last year. Perhaps the question would arise naturally, though, if the EU isn't championing that mitigation message and that fossil fuel phase-out message, even where I understand, it's more complicated in terms of negotiating dynamics, there's an element of, well, if the EU isn't championing it, who is? And in terms of, the forthcoming EU Council conclusions on its COP31 negotiating mandate, it would be very important that fossil fuel phase-out provisions are central to that. And I guess, Philip has already raised this, but it really brings into focus, given the extreme challenges and perhaps lack of progress in certain areas at COPs, Ireland's efforts with Tuvalu and taking forward, both partnering with Tuvalu in terms of the conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels. And we'd love to work with government on that to try and support that process. And just last but not least, doubling back a little bit, I forgot to mention that, of course, on the COP side, Philip mentioned the issue of accessibility. Again, I think there'll be several Irish NGOs who'd like to engage with government on that, given, our really strong history of putting forward, new and additional focus on putting forward new and additional grant-based finance. So that would be a further priority in terms of the COP process as well. And I'll park it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much to Gerry and also to Sven for those reflections from the Irish civil society and from the EU level as well. Please keep your questions coming in the chat, and thank you so much to Philip for answering some of those as they come in. I'm going to give the floor very quickly to our colleague Arianna Labassin at the European Environmental Bureau, as Arianna has to shortly leave for a different engagement. But Arianna, I will give you the floor, and then afterwards we will have some reflections from the speakers and some additional question and answer. So Arianna, please.
Thank you so much. Just quick check, you hear me? Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, and also to the previous speakers. I'm Arianna Labassin from the European Environmental Bureau, and as EEB, something that we do with the presidencies every 6 months is that we produce a memorandum for the upcoming presidency, and the points that you see on the slides are our 10 points for the Irish. And at the same time, we also produce an assessment of the ending presidency. And these two papers will be published on July 1st, so you will find them on our website. I'm not going to read you through all our 10 points, but I want to focus on few of them. And some of my points will also reinforce some of the things that have already been said. And indeed, I want to start with the first point, which is what we hope and we already heard Ireland is to focus on implementation and not rolling back existing legislation. The presidencies do in their priorities that they publish do put at the center simplification, but we also welcome what we heard, the public rejection of the regulation agenda. But indeed, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, as it has already been said, but we know that we need to foster implementation more than ever, because since the beginning of the second mandate, the Commission introduced no fewer than 10 omnibuses, and the accelerated pace of these procedures do undermine transparency, scrutiny, and democratic debate, risking significant chances slipping through a bit unnoticed. And this also goes very much hand in hand with a wave of disinformation. We saw that the previous trio, the Polish, Danish, and Cypriot trio, did put a lot of focus on the fight against disinformation, which was very welcome and necessary, because tackling disinformation is indeed a fight for Europe's security. So we really hope that Ireland will guarantee that the simplification efforts will be evidence-based, proportionate, and subject to impact assessment, and that the omnibus packages will be limited to technical adjustments only, avoiding substantive changes without proper scrutiny as well. The second point that I want to make is to focus on CAP, because Ireland will play a key role in the CAP negotiations. The Irish indeed will find themselves picking up again the CAP reform that speed up in 2026, and will have a crucial role in ensuring that high sustainability ambition across these areas to support a just transition in our food and farming system will be maintained. So we really hope also that at the same time, the historic consensus that was reached with the strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture in 2024 provides a crucial stepping stone for this effort. And we really hope that the presidency will embrace table in this negotiation. The third point I want to make is MFF. I know MFF has been already touched upon, but I want to stress again one point, which is the support for civil society. Because a strong democracies and transparent governance require adequate infrastructure and resources for citizens' voices to be heard. And so civil society...
Arianna, I think we're losing your connection a little bit, unless it's just me. So perhaps you can cut your video. In fact, I think we've lost Arianna, all of us, haven't we? So I don't see Arianna, and I think she may have dropped out. And I know that she is in Brussels elsewhere on the go before another meeting. So what we will do is we will pause here and we can come back to Arianna in a moment. But I thought actually, having heard from the last few speakers, and I know, Philip, you've been answering some of those questions in the chat, and we much appreciate that. Perhaps, as I know you also need to leave, perhaps you want to respond to some of the points that we've made so far, or any kind of reflections from your side.
Thanks, Joe. No, I think I'm on top of the specific questions so far. But just, I think it's encouraging that across the different presentations that there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of what we see as the key strategic challenges are, and the need to, I guess, reflect on the world as it is rather than the world as we would like it to be, and kind of deal with it on that basis, because we could waste a lot of time, I think, hoping for it to be different. But as I say, I think the objectives that were set a number of years ago when the Green Deal was agreed, they remain valid. I think the narrative needs to change in order to bring people along with us domestically, and reference was made to by Sven to the way the argument is shaping up on ETS as an example, where people, I think, are using it as using competitiveness as a reason to unpick the fundamentals, and we think that the competitiveness argument is actually a strong basis to proceed with ETS as it is, to make refinements to it, to make it work better, but not to unpick the fundamentals of what has been a relative success story in terms of EU climate policy. So no, just again would like to thank everybody for the engagement. If anybody wants to get in touch separately, I'm very happy to do so. I see there's a question from Jack. I'm not sure specifically what the question is, but feel free to get in touch. I'll be around for another few minutes in this call anyway, so if you want to kind of come back with the question again, I'll be happy to go back to you.
Thanks so much, Philip. That's great. And in the meantime, I see we have Arianna returned to the call, so I'm going to unmute Arianna. Please do feel free to continue adding those inputs in the chats, everyone. And we will still have a bit of time also after the next speaker, Ciara Brennan, for some discussion. But in the meantime, we will go back to Arianna, and I hope that we'll be able to hear you clearly this time. Arianna.
I'm here. I don't know what happened. You can hear me, right? I would like to blame the heat wave, but the weather is way cooler today in Brussels, so I cannot do that. But apologies, I'm back. I was saying, at least where I stopped, I was stressing for the need for a dedicated operating grant to fund civil society organization in the future MFF, because indeed participation in the EU policy development, implementation, and enforcement is required, and we required a dedicated operating grant in the next MFF. And so one of the points that we really wanted to stress is the support to civil society. One of the last points I want to make is under the big umbrella of biodiversity, because during the Irish presidency, the Commission plans to support the rollout of the water resilience strategy, including via structured dialogue with the member states, as an opportunity to close the water acquis implementation gap by 2027. It's also at the same time due to publish the evaluation of the Nitrates Directive and decide on its future. And we do believe that the Nitrates Directive is fit for purpose and should be maintained. But implementation, reporting, and enforcement should be strengthened in line also with the recommendations that have been given by the European Court of Auditors. So the presidency really should organize the council support for an impactful implementation, and also we stress for a zero tolerance of non-compliance with the Nitrates Directive, and insist on the need to complement it by additional actions, such as the promise, for example, integrated nutrient management action plan to finally address nitrate pollution on our water environment. On this, also, one of the alarming things is the ongoing revision of the Water Framework Directive, which this revision would allow for more mining pollution into our waterways, which as a consequence threatens not only the economy, climate resilience, but also public health. And so the presidency really has a role to play in pushing back the revision of the Water Framework Directive and lead to step up implementation and enforcement of the directive. Finally, I wanted to say a few words on the ongoing stress test of the Birds and Habitat Directive, which disregards the benefit of these laws that these laws bring to people and the economy, and overlooks a bit the opportunities that their enhanced implementation and enforcement can bring about. So here as well, the Irish Presidency has a role to play in maintaining the integrity of the EU laws and nature laws, and insist for the stress test of the Birds and Habitats Directive to bring about impactful implementation of these laws, backed by a strong political will and funding as well. Because we know that the Irish Presidency is committed to reverse biodiversity law. There is good wording in the priorities, and also we saw that there is an holistic approach to the fight against climate change that wants to integrate biodiversity, water, and climate policies. And indeed, in order to keep to have a true holistic approach, it's it would be important to keep the Water Framework Directive intact in this view. To conclude, the bottom line is a bit that some files arrive in Dublin's hands a bit unfinished or moving in the wrong direction. This is not a criticism in a vacuum, but it's the starting point as well for what we need from Ireland. And so if I can sum up 3 key points, it's not to let competitiveness or simplification become a bit of cover for lower ambition. At the same time, to really defend what's already agreed and already under pressure. And last but not least, to treat civil society as a partner and not just a box to tick, especially as NGOs' space in the environmental policymaking space keeps shrinking in the EU. Thank you so much, and sorry for cutting off before.
Thank you so much, Arianna, for this input, and we will share a link to the full memorandum. I'm sure many of you have read it already, available from the EB. So thank you so much, Arianna. We will go straight ahead to the final speaker for this afternoon, which is Ciara Brennan, who's going to speak about the multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, the acronym you have heard already several times this afternoon. So Ciara, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Joe, for introduction, and also to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. Just by way of very quick background, Environmental Justice Network, we're a Belfast-based organisation. We operate on an all-island basis on the island of Ireland, and we work on national, EU, and EU legal and policy development. So just to say, this is a very short presentation to cover what's a very complicated topic, but we've published extensive material on climate governance and environmental democracy, including lots of material on the presidency and the MFF on the website. So I've now posted a link to the recent publications in the chat. I'm very happy to follow up if anybody has any specific questions after the session today. But as Joe said, I'm going to speak briefly about steering the EU's multi-annual financial framework towards climate action and just transition. So if we can hop straight to the next slide, that would be great. Because I think one of the things we need to think about at the start here is why the MFF matters for climate. We know this is going to be, the MFF is one of the key things that's happening during the Irish presidency at EU level. But I think it's important to remember that it's being negotiated against a really complicated political and economic backdrop. We've already heard from Philip earlier on this, but at the minute, the EU is facing simultaneous pressures to accelerate the clean transition, strengthen competitiveness, increase defence, and respond to social and regional inequalities, all within really tight fiscal constraints. So this growing emphasis on competitiveness and simplification that we've already heard mentioned loads of times today, but there's a real risk that this is going to crowd out environmental ambition and weaken safeguards. So I think why the MFF is so important is because the design choices made during this period about the EU's budget on things like targets, governance, flexibility, conditionalities, all of these are going to play a really decisive role in determining whether EU spending accelerates the clean transition and maintains social fairness and democratic accountability, or whether these objectives are diluted in practice. So it's really, really important for us to think about that when we're looking at the EU budget and how it's designed. I think it's also vital to remember what the presidency can and cannot do. So thinking back to what Philip said earlier in the webinar, the presidency doesn't decide the budget. We can't set it, the Irish presidency can't set a figure or impose an outcome, but as the country in the chair for 6 months, Ireland can steer negotiations through the pace it sets, the priorities it highlights, the way it frames choices, and the level of ambition built into the Council's positions. This is a really, really important role, and it's a really, really important time in these negotiations. So I think last week, or in the June European Council, the leaders tasked the incoming presidency with advancing the negotiations for the October European Council with the aim of political agreement by the end of 2026. So it couldn't be happening at a more important time. But if we could just hop to the next slide, please. I think what we need to think about is, from an environmental and climate perspective, what are the key asks during this period? And I think we really want Ireland to steer negotiations towards a budget that is ultimately aligned with the EU's climate goals. So one of the key things here is to keep and protect the 35% climate and environment spending target, and to defend the overall scale of the budget, because if it's reduced, then climate and biodiversity protections are going to be reduced as well. So I think, to respond quickly to one of the questions in the chat, I think, we also think that Ireland needs to press for a guaranteed minimum share for nature within each national plan, so that biodiversity isn't squeezed out under a single climate and environment target. So that's really important as well. I think another point is to make sure that we fix what counts as climate spending rather than just focus on the headline figure. So I think the 35% target will only deliver if the money behind it is genuinely green. So Ireland can press in the negotiations for a credible tracking method, and we think that's really important. It's also, the European Court of Auditors and others have already warned that the current method overstates the budget's green impact. So I think looking kind of under the bonnet, if you will, as to what counts as green spending is really important. We think, obviously keeping the budget in line with the EU's 2030 and 2040 climate targets is really important. It's important that budget decisions and climate commitments are kind of, done in tandem rather than drifting apart. And that's really important for the EU's wider climate work later this year, including on the 2040 target and the preparations for the COP. So in addition to that, keeping the do no significant harm rule is really important. I think, our clear definition of what activities cannot be funded and kind of resisting carve out is really important. And then finally, I think the EU's own resources, these are the designated revenue streams that finance the EU budget. And I think at the June European Council, own resources really became the central task handed to the Irish presidency. So I think, if we have to make cuts of up to 40% across the budget, if own resources aren't developed properly, those are cuts that are going to fall on climate and nature and just transition along with everything else. So I think our analysis would be that securing new revenue is probably one of the most direct ways that Ireland can protect the green and social content of the budget. So next slide, please. On the issue of the just transition, we think it's really vital that negotiations are steered towards a budget that can deliver a fair and just transition. Anchoring this as a funded structural commitment, for rules that mean that every national, regional, and partnership plan includes a just transition chapter, and really clear definitions of which regions qualify and what the dedicated support for those regions are. I think Ireland can champion a real say for people affected. It's really important to involve, have proper consultation whenever those plans are drawn up. I think putting affordability and cost of living on the agenda, steering council discussions towards targeted help for low-income households and small businesses is vital. And then also, ensuring that there's conditions on what public money goes to large companies. So attaching social and climate conditionalities to industrial funding is really important. So just next slide is my conclusions. And again, I'm aware I'm rattling through these issues, but there's just quite a lot to cover in it. But our conclusions would be, you have to kind of think about how do these asks, which are quite significant asks, align with the Ireland's presidency priorities that have been published. So Sven and Gerry have already discussed these previously in the webinar, but I think from our view, it's important to note that although climate and environment appear throughout the published priorities, they are mostly framed as things that can support growth, security, and resilience rather than goals in their own right. And I think that's to some extent understandable. But I think when you qualify environmental commitments with phrases like safeguarding competitiveness, affordable, simplification, it's important that we recognize that there's a risk that Europe's climate, nature, and social protections could be weakened, in the name of simplification. And I think the presidency will play a key role in ensuring that doesn't happen. I think it's also important that Ireland leads by example. And we've also already heard, I think Gerry was raising earlier, that we believe that Ireland will be a stronger advocate at EU level if it matches the ambition it calls for with credible climate action at home and ensures that climate plans are robust, coherent, and properly consulted on. It's important as well that Ireland meets EU deadlines on the production of key plans. So we've seen in the past that there's been really quite shocking delays in the production of national long-term strategies, the national energy and climate plans, and we are well overdue production of the social climate plan. So, it's going to be hard for Ireland to champion these plans and EU's climate trajectory if at home we are so delayed in producing those plans that are really vital. However, that negative aside, I think there's been many positives that Ireland can bring to the table. I think in addition to the positive and proactive attitude and experience of delivery in the presidency role that Philip mentioned, Ireland has really well developed just transition initiatives and a just transition commission, which plays a really important role within our national climate governance structures. So this is an important experience because we can show what is working, what is not, and help that to make the case for keeping just transition funded and within the budget. And I think Ireland has that unique ability at the minute to keep that convening power of the presidency role, to keep just transition high on the political agenda, to bring governments together around it and propose, a presidency-led declaration on just transition, for example. I also think, and you'll recognize from my accent that I'm from Belfast, everybody in Ireland, but I think the all-Ireland position is really important as well, because if EU rules are weakened under the banner of simplification, there's direct consequences on the island of Ireland, including across the border into Northern Ireland. And Ireland as a member state is very well placed to speak about the potential cross-border risks of simplification. So we think that's really important to use the presidency to protect those sort of strong environmental standards. And finally, ultimately, we just think that the Irish presidency is a really important opportunity to help promote an EU budget, aligning competitiveness with decarbonisation, flexibility with safeguards, and simplification with democratic accountability. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chiara, for this really clear input on one of the most important priorities the Irish presidency is going to face in the next 6 months. So we still have a few minutes left, and thank you very much to everyone who's been engaging in the chat so far. If you would like to ask a question to the speakers that we have here, so Chiara, Gerry, Sven, and Clitos, you're very welcome to do so by raising your hand. Thank you so much also to all of you for staying engaged throughout the very dense flow of information that we've had during this super interesting webinar this afternoon. So I give a couple of minutes to hear from the floor. We have about 6 minutes, so please keep your questions nice and concise. Jack O'Sullivan, I see you have your hand raised.
Thank you very much. That's great, Joe. Very quickly. I don't know if our friend from the department is here or not. Just trying to remember his name. Philip Nugent. I liked very much what he's gone, but just want to put in a few points here. I think his point about small countries is very good. And it's worth noting that the current 3 countries, the one just passed, Cyprus, Ireland holding the presidency from literally tomorrow, and Lithuania will be the next one, also a very small country. And the selection of 3 small countries together is excellent. Now, question. We're looking at the moment in Zero Waste Alliance Ireland at the Nature Restoration Regulation. And I'm very impressed by how the whole of government approach, whole of society approach has been taken by the state for this particular issue. My question, if Philip was here, but anybody else can answer it, is there going to be a whole of government, whole of society approach to the agenda and the policies for the EU presidency of Ireland? Bit late to ask it, maybe. Should have been done a while ago, but that's a very important one. My second question is the presidency going to have a look at access to information, the Aarhus Convention, the Aarhus Agenda? I don't see it on the list. Very important. And what Philip has said has convinced us in Zero Waste Alliance Ireland too, that we should look through the competitive lens to try and make arguments for better care of biodiversity, ecosystems and species. Not see competitors as a barrier, but try to make the best use of it, turn the argument around to make it positive. Thanks, Joe, for letting me in there.
Thanks a lot, Jack. I don't know if Gerry or Clitos, either of you want to respond. And equally, there are a few questions that are emerging in the chat. And I can see that Sean has added there some relevant information on the data on which competitiveness is being based on. I don't know, Gerry or Clitos, you'd have to raise your hand because I can't see. Yeah.
Hi there. So, yes, I absolutely do agree with you, Jack, on the really important role of small member states. I, I I mean, I would say that, like evidently each member state has its own priorities, but what I probably maybe more so hone in on is the very good points that have been raised around, particularly for Ireland, around the competitiveness agenda not taking precedence or undermining um, its commitments on the climate side. And, as has been said, that, its climate and environmental commitments are not subservient in any sense to its to the competitiveness agenda, which really seems to have taken hold. And I guess our experience would be that we would have concerns that some of the perhaps departments which are maybe more so leading on the competitiveness, trade, business development side, that their views are maybe more so being heard than those of other relevant departments and state agencies. But I think Ciara articulated that point very, very well. I don't think I've fully answered your question, Jack, but just wanted to acknowledge it.
Thanks a lot, Gerry. I see a thumbs up from Jack, so thanks for taking it on. Any final questions or thoughts in the final minutes that we have together this afternoon? And equally, if Ciara or Sven or any other speaker would like to add a final word. So not seeing any further hands. I see a hand from our colleague Oshin at the Irish Environmental Network. Oshin.
Thanks, Joe. It was just a reflection on other people's reflections on what Philip was saying and on what Gerry said there, which is that, Philip himself spoke about how long he's been at this and in climate diplomacy, and he's, I think it's fair to say, good at his job in climate diplomacy. And if his approach, if how he articulated the approach today was actually the whole of government approach, or even the whole of department approach in the department he represents consistently and coherently, Ireland might not be quite such a laggard as we are now going into the presidency. So I think I would just take from that not that anyone here would fall into this trap. There's no basis for complacency on our engagement with this presidency and with this government on their delivery or lack of climate ambition based on anything said today, even though obviously we gained a bit more information and intelligence on some of the approaches to some of the issues. And again, there's a professionalism across the civil service. We've seen it in the Perm Rep as well, in the handling of the files of the presidency. That is sort of separate, shall we say, from whatever level of political will there is in the government to deliver climate action at home. So because it's slightly, it can be for those of us who are engaged on an ongoing basis with this government on climate, there's a slight whiplash between the sort of messages we're hearing today and what's happening in the Parliament on LNG and passenger caps, etc. So just a reflection on listening to him over the last hour.
Thanks very much, Oshin. And I would just ask one of my colleagues, Kasia or Samuel, to unmute Ciara, because unfortunately my computer has decided to update itself and I'm not able to access the controls. So please could Kasia unmute Ciara?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe and Katja. Yeah, just to say that I think this is why, going to the question that Jack asked, it's why these plans are so important. And I think sometimes they're sort of seen as bureaucratic or sort of tick box exercises, like the long-term strategy, the NACP, social climate plan, and now we're now going to be faced with the national and regional partnership plans. Like, they're not bureaucratic exercises. They are the design tools that deal with coherency across this whole of government approach. And if you don't have plans that are dealing with cross-cutting issues that are coherent, there needs to be coherency between these plans. You need to consult with stakeholders, make it easy for people to engage with the plan making process, then you're not going to get coherency. And that's, I think, driving forward. It's giving cover to a lack of urgency, which we don't have the time to do, as Oshin mentioned. So I think getting Ireland's timetable for production of these plans in line with when the EU deadlines are would be a really, really good first step. And I think that's very, very important, especially when we're looking like with the review of the governance regulation that's happening at EU level. Like, for example, the NECPs and long-term strategies are probably going to be merged, which means that it should be easier for countries, for member states to produce plans. But it's the coherency and consistency between them and making sure that the numbers ultimately add up that is going to help deal with that whole of government, whole of country approach, I think.
Thanks so much, Chiara. So I think on this note about participation and about planning, I think it's a good place to end our discussion today. So on behalf of the Irish Environmental Network, Stop Climate Chaos, EUKI, CanEurope, and the European Environmental Bureau, thank you so much for your engagement this afternoon. We will be sharing all of the slides and materials that were shared by our speakers, as well as a recording. And of course, throughout the Irish presidency, we stand ready to engage with you on how to engage with this presidency to ensure a just and ambitious outcomes for climate, nature, and people. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the afternoon.